Chapter 10, Responsibility. Karl Popper, one of the world's most influential philosophers, could be described as the king of liberalism and critical thinking. For Popper, the practical meaning of critical thinking is that the citizen bears personal responsibility for society's proper conduct. Popper experienced the rise of Nazism and his world's collapse, despite his Jewish parents having converted to Lutheranism before his birth. He believed that every citizen must keep her or his eyes closely glued to the government's actions and take action to correct improprieties. Despite his firm stance in praise of tolerance, he stated that unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force. For it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. And we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or to kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. Don't you agree that this text is as relevant as ever? A society wishing to survive needs to learn how to maneuver carefully between these two directions, giving space and legitimacy to discussion of highly controversial issues while avoiding a culture of unrestrained criticism in which social polarization is the destructive result. Popper saw what institutionalized hatred looked like and how those in power can use it to gain political power. He understood very well that hatred is like a fire. When hatred's flames are fanned across the public, inevitably it ends in bloodshed. The hate-feeding social network's algorithm looks different to us. It isn't flamed by tyrannical dictators, but by young Americans who believe in Western liberal values. The algorithm is intended to accrue economic rather than political power. And in retrospect, each of us has the choice of joining or distancing from social networks. But don't fall prey to illusions. The danger inherent in encouraging and promoting hate-driven discourse between groups within society is the same anger that Popper warned of. 2016 marks the start of focused persecution by Myanmar's military against the country's Muslim minority. The moral grounds justifying this oppression were set up in advance by the military through an extensive hate and disinformation campaign on Facebook. Once public opinion had been sufficiently primed, the ethnic cleansing began, resulting in mass rape and the murder of 24,000 people. According to the UN, Nobel Peace Laureate and Myanmar Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi also took an active part in these events. In 2021, a suit for damages was submitted against Facebook based on the claim that its algorithms exacerbated hatred against the Rohingya people, and that Facebook did not remove outright calls for genocide despite requests and warnings sent to the company. Let's not be racist here. Myanmar isn't far, far away, nor are the Rohingya those barbarians. Myanmar and the Rohingya are very close, and the situation is extremely dangerous. If you're imagining a society that collapses into a bloodbath driven by civil war, there's no need for your imagination to conjure guerrilla warfare in some vague location in Afghanistan. Rather, think about ethnic cleansing occurring in London or New York. That's the result of a society collapsing due to baseless hatred. As a way of consolidating educational stances to combat Western social polarization, think tank teams were established worldwide. But their conclusions mustn't be allowed to become yellowed pages in thick folders that aren't read by anyone. The general public must learn about the evil manipulations that content on social networks facilitates and the level of irresponsibility they manifest. I'm not referring to educating only the younger generations, although that's of vital importance, of course, especially since young people tend more frequently to get swept up into violent arguments. It turns out that adults without sufficient digital orientation also tend to believe fake news. In fact, they'll follow it more faithfully than the young generation. Education for responsibility needs to focus on all layers of the population, and not, as it's perhaps convenient to assume, just the general masses or people with poor formal education. The battle against polarizing sources, which we've reviewed in the past few chapters, needs to be accompanied by a suitable educational plan, such as that operating in Finland. Digital orientation. Finland has an interesting neighbor, Vladimir Putin. Russia and Finland share a very long border, which is why their modern histories are closely interwoven. In 2014, the Finns tensed when Russia invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and encouraged a civil war in that region. The military move began by preparing public opinion through an internet propaganda campaign claiming Russia's historical right to Crimea, accompanied by false publications about horrific actions by the Ukrainian militia, akin to those which took place in Myanmar. The same happened when the English version of this book was published in 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine the second time. The history between Finland and Russia's subversion through the internet made little Finland, with its 5 million people in total, suspicious and anxious. When false stories about Finland, meant to weaken that country, began appearing in the digital space, the Finns activated their education system to repel the attack. Let there be no doubt, this was a military attack. A stunning NATO report describes the conscious strategies wielded by Russia for the purpose of undermining social stability in its neighbor country during that period. The report analyzes how materials were spread and is accompanied by eye-opening examples. Reading it sent me back to my own military service. Deception tactics, assault routes, delegating tasks, and so on. The supreme goal being to incite the public against government bodies, media outlets, and general disruption of the country's social fabric. In response, Finland activated an innovative program which is fully accessible online and encourages children to independently assess the veracity of news items appearing on websites. Program participants are required to actively search for fake news and locate its sources. They learn how to understand the way a news item can use statistical data and manipulate it to present a specific picture. The Finnish education system instills knowledge of digital orientation in art classes, explaining how images can be digitally edited to convey a different message than the source image presents. In history classes, by analyzing propaganda drives, and in science classes, by examining COVID-19 denial and fake news about vaccinations. Finland's goal was to actively teach and learn through hands-on experience and examples. 1. Students are guided towards meta-thinking, critical thinking relative to their own thought patterns. For example, why do I identify with the stance that I present, and how important is it to me? Am I in an internet echo chamber? 2. Students learn to recognize fake news and how to check for facts, such as cross-referencing sources through internet searches. 3. Students learn to evaluate media bias. 4. Students are asked to identify platforms, Facebook, YouTube, etc., that covert propaganda campaigns. And I'd add that there's a need to inculcate a deeper understanding of all aspects of social networks. Although we presume social network services to be free of charge, we pay for them with our attention and time, which are worth a fortune to social networks. A paid service would be far healthier. The Finnish program succeeded for good reason, which has to do with factors such as the population's homogeneity and the basic trust that media and government institutions there have earned. The broad public consensus regarding the identity of the attacking digital enemy is because it's Russia. In fact, Russia is a never disappointing source of fake news, as noted on euvsdisinfo.eu. Once an enemy has a name and tangible address, coping with that enemy becomes simpler. In other countries, matters are more complex. The attack can often derive from a sector within a population, usually with the generous assistance of the reward and distribution mechanisms on which social networks function. When your enemy is the neighbor whose door is opposite yours, whether devout or secular, black or white, and so on, coping is sevenfold harder. Aiming to figure out what could drive one's neighbor to spread false information, a study was conducted by Haifa University and Safed College in Israel. The researchers located surfers who shared blatantly fake news and interviewed them for the purpose of examining the moral reasons and pretexts they based their actions on. 4 types of justifications came to light in the study. 1, maybe the information I shared was erroneous, but because it reflects a real phenomenon, my action is moral. 2, I'm not a journalist. It's not my job to check, and whoever wrote the post must have checked. Let's call this claim shifted responsibility. 3. We're in a political war. I need to share so that I can influence our side. They also do that. If I sit here checking every bit of information, we'll lose the war. 4. It can't hurt. The common denominator to these statements is that all of them slough off moral responsibility, even if there's no logic to doing so. The second type of justification is completely circular. The person who shared the information right before me most probably checked, and therefore there's no point in me checking. But what will the person who shares your post say? The researchers went a step further and presented a narrative with a covert theme in which false information would cause someone to lose their job. The researchers discovered that the number of participants willing to share the post dropped drastically once they were exposed to the story. In other words, the research reinforces the efficacy of the Finnish approach. Educating towards social responsibility can be a significant factor in the war against spreading fake news. Personal responsibility. As a social network surfer, I try to be part of the solution. When I see a polarizing post, even if it aligns with my personal political views but uses violent language towards the opposing political arena, I roll up my sleeves and make the author confront her or his text. It's hard because usually things get written within the echo chamber format, but it's the right thing to do. I found it's easiest to write something like, "David, please cite your source of information, and if there is none, please delete this post. It drives hatred for no good reason." This kind of response is so effective that the conversation tends to take a new angle, and the post is often removed or toned down, and only very few choose to ignore me. Irrespective of a particular thread's outcome, the next question left hanging is, how is it that normal people change their spots so readily in the digital world and become hate spreaders? People love expressing their moral stances on the internet. It makes them feel great about themselves, especially when we know that what we wrote will enjoy a broad readership. And psychologists have coined a term for it: moral license. Let's say you're walking down the street, you see a homeless person, you hand over some cash. Great. Now you're all pleased with yourself, and if you see a beggar 20 steps further down the street, you'll feel okay about passing without a second glance because, after all, you've already done a good deed that day. Real life gets similarly reflected on the social network. If we've expressed a view which to our minds is moral and we've gotten likes and shares, we'll allow ourselves to cut corners. We might have great fun defaming some politician or public figure we don't like, simultaneously making our modest contribution to social polarization and Zuckerberg's wallet. That's why a skeptical perspective towards our own moral codes and those of our society is vital to building and preserving a non-polarizing discourse. Sigmund Freud worded it well. If you want to expel religion from our European civilization, you can only do it by means of another system of doctrines, and such a system would, from the outset, take over all the psychological characteristics of religion. The same sanctity, rigidity, and intolerance, the same prohibition of thought for its own defense. We are all familiar with people who are non-believers, religion-wise, and who, on the other hand, consider their ideologies inviolable and conduct all-out war against anyone who opposes their view. When one understands that each of us has a bit of religious fervor regarding the values we hold dearest, we can also understand that this moral posturing is unavoidable as well as ineffective. In the end, we need to realize that we must focus on the shared aim of preserving social wholeness, even at the cost of foregoing the pleasure of being the moral individual in the discussion. In academia, the rawest division is the splitting of natural sciences, engineering, social sciences, and humanities into faculties. Math is central to all research methods in the natural sciences and most engineering departments. With little other option available, most research conducted in the social sciences uses statistics because the issues they explore deal with complex human behaviors, which mathematical models find difficult to encompass. That's because mathematical models investigate how a phenomenon occurs, whereas statistical analysis suits the investigation of any linkage between the phenomenon and a particular environmental characteristic. Scientific progress is considered reliable only after the outcomes have been peer-reviewed. In other words, a paper delineating research results is sent to researchers worldwide who examine the findings and reply with one of three decisions. 1, the paper is rejected. 2, the findings can be published subject to certain corrections and improvements. Or 3, the paper is accepted for publication in a scientific journal. When it comes to my work, the third option makes me grin. At last, a smart reviewer understands the greatness of my paper. Alternatively, the research method customary in the humanities is debate. Trying to infuse this system with some semblance of precise research and simultaneously earn admiration equivalent to that applied to scientific methodology, the peer review element is preserved. The trouble is that the only tool available to peer review judges, in this case, is their personal viewpoints. The outcome of peer review in the humanities is very similar to the naming game we were acquainted with in Chapter 7. Almost wall-to-wall uniformity of opinion in humanities departments, such that most of those departments are characterized by a single perspective, usually postmodernist, which, among other things, includes the subversion against any inconvenient truth. The actual result of this method is that every unifying narrative, such as on nationalism or basic solidarity, is presented as a collection of fabrications, and anyone holding a more or less postmodernist approach is exempt from public and national responsibility. On the other side of the aisle, the populism spreading through the world in recent years also removes responsibility from its followers. As we saw in Chapter 5, the essence of populism is to recruit support via simplistic, engaging slogans. Populism markets magic solutions, which, in retrospect, claim to solve all the world's social and economic problems. In the real world, there are very few simple solutions to complicated problems, and the general outcome of this approach will be damage in the longer term. Most likely, by then it won't be during the populist shift. The populist will no longer be around to experience the outcome or take responsibility for it. We come across this trend of sloughing off personal responsibility, not only in the conceptual world surrounding us. I run into it every day at the personal and professional level. When I see my email inbox filled with complaints from students, I discover that the phenomenon of shifting blame is not limited to political discourse. Too many students view their failures as deriving solely from my cruelty. In the physician-patient relationship, similar things are happening. Almost every day, my wife comes home from the clinic with stories of patients loaded with insights about the failures of hospitals and doctors' consultations, and who primarily avoid taking any responsibility for their illnesses. Parents fill their kids up with sugary foods, then vent their anger at the medical system for not finding a wonder cure for obesity. Incidentally, the growing trend of violent reactions by patients against medical teams is similarly linked to shifting blame onto others. The number of medical faculty participating in workshops on handling patient-sourced violence grows by the year. We shouldn't wait for existential crises. Each of us should take on personal responsibility in areas that suit our personalities. A person with a dominant trident trait of conscientiousness tends to feel that responsibility is an essential part of their nature. People who are open to experience tend to take initiatives in stride. Extroverts discover that they're able to lead others. National responsibility. It's quite stunning that with the single word apartheid, the entire Zionist project can be decimated, just as colonialism does to the conceptual infrastructure behind the American Revolution, and oppression to a leader's legitimacy to rule. People who bandy these words around often feel a sense of power, of smashing idols which served as cultural symbols. Christopher Columbus, Thomas Jefferson, Winston Churchill, for example. Who cares? After all, the country won't collapse, and government institutions won't disband simply because someone wrote an extreme post. A government can absorb endless criticism without damaging anything vital. Milk will continue being delivered to the shops, and electricity will continue flowing, so you've got light in the bathroom whenever you need it. Even if slamming those terms around causes a bit of a disturbance, it's surely for a good cause, such as a minority group's rights. So why not praise public wokeness? The problem is that it's all nonsense. Pax Americana, the Zionist project, and Basically, the whole Western style of culture, as we've come to recognize it, is just a few centuries old, the blink of an eye relative to history. It's clear that social structures can collapse if we don't watch them closely with both eyes open. Government institutions in society, as we've come to know them, were built up with a great deal of effort, discussions and disputes, trials and tribulations, and wars. The growing calls for radical change threaten the social stability we mistakenly take for granted. In a certain internet discussion, a good friend declared that a revolution is preferable to the current state of things. But revolutions, as we've seen, don't always end well. Usually they end with dead bodies lying in the streets, mass rapes, and migrating masses. Maybe, if you've got tons of good fortune, you'll still be alive to lick your wounds and try to rehabilitate your life. Is that a dramatic description? Sure, but it needs restating to everyone caught up in the exhilaration of a revolution. Once again, don't imagine these scenes as belonging to the French Revolution. Imagine the terrible violence that would break out on Fifth Avenue in New York, or up and down Tel Aviv's primary artery, Dizengoff Street. The blessing of pragmatism. My parents worked hard for their livelihood and saved, bit by bit, to enable my brother and me the opportunity of a more comfortable life, filled with love and kindness. The catchphrase customary in our home was, "Look before you leap." It was a guiding statement. Don't endanger everything you've achieved because of a capricious or crazy choice. It doesn't mean that we should live in eternal fear of failure. On the contrary, we should take up the battle when there's practical value in doing so, while keeping in mind that nothing we have in life should be taken for granted. That's how I've lived my life so far, by trying to find the pragmatic aspect in every area of life. Objectives that seem too vague, I leave for the future, but like Cato the Elder, I store them in my mind. The same is true of my political views. I'm happy to adopt stances which seem right from a geopolitical, economic, and social analysis, but those which I find inappropriate, I'm happy to shed until an appropriate time frame or altogether. What results is that in political arguments, I'm not identified fully with any particular side. The same is true for several of my close friends. Some years ago, the then editor of Israel's Haaretz daily newspaper was a guest at the university where I teach. A discussion was followed by audience questions. A good friend, a professor of computer sciences, asked if the editor had ever changed his political stance. His firm answer, no. My friend sat down quietly, then whispered to me, "So why are we even talking?" A smile was enough for us to indicate our agreement with each other. Holding to one stance despite life's complexity, without ever feeling a sense of identification with an opposing stance is, well, very odd. Pragmatism in political life means casting a critical gaze at all sides, knowing that there are no absolute sheep or absolute wolves. In my view, Trump can't serve as a figure of inspiration, but he most certainly brought a lot of good to Israel and the Middle East and strengthened the Western world. Obama, by contrast, showed a woeful lack of comprehension concerning the forces operating in the Mideast, but he's a really nice kind of guy, and I can identify with him on issues around coping with the climate crisis. Total identification with Trump or Obama, or total uncompromising loathing of either, primarily indicates capitulation to the problematic forces we've discussed so far in this book. Taking responsibility at the national level means being able to read the geopolitical map in the spirit of current situations. Neither the conservatives nor the liberals have a monopoly over wisdom, and neither of the two definitions describes absolute values. Rather, they primarily indicate a tendency and conceptual affiliation. The reasoning behind identifying as a liberal or a conservative in the USA continually changes over the years, according to the burning issues being dealt with at any particular time. At the end of the day, the differences between the political right and left are quantitative and not fundamental. The majority of people learn to live with compromise, be flexible, and even find some advantages in every situation. The tendency to either preserve a social structure as is at any price, or to automatically support anything that appears like a change, is the sole domain of extremists. For most of us, conservatism and liberalism do not mean preserving or changing at any cost. That's an attitude aptly described in a single word: stupidity. In the USA, the lack of national responsibility has reached higher levels than ever before and is threatening the very fabric of society. Calls to change the basic definitions pertaining to the people who constitute society have become dominant. Among them are demands to redefine gender, accusations of white privilege, which constitute a discriminatory attack on the success of white-skinned people simply for their skin color, and delegitimization of the police, and all are symptoms of the same problem. Things are pretty similar in Europe. Denial of nationalism's legitimacy as a concept has become a policy and emblem of progress. Calls for Europe to absorb all immigrants blatantly ignoring each nation's needs. These exaggerations should be setting off the Western world's reddest flashing lights and should certainly be central to extensive educational efforts. As we've seen, the voices of a persistent minority in this social network era can drive extraordinarily powerful forces, even if the minority's claim is disconnected from reality or ahead of its time. Catch 67 was published by Micah Goodman in 2017. It's a brilliant example of positive force. The author is an agent of good in Israeli society. In a very balanced manner, the book examines the issue of holding the regions Israelis call Judea and Samaria during a period in which this issue was at the core of dispute within Israeli society. Views on what constituted a suitable action strategy ranged from extreme left to extreme right, but Goodman describes the advantages and disadvantages of the political middle ground in a way that makes the effect of the extreme political camps extraneous. He describes a situation where identification with a political side becomes uncompromising rather than pragmatic. For me, reading this book was a formative experience, developing my views on national responsibility. These days, the burning dispute in Israel revolves around the war between government authorities, the judiciary versus the executive arms. I imagine that had I taken on a project similar to the one Goodman did on our current time's hottest topic, my analysis would revolve around taking a bird's eye view of the political parties' arguments in a way that shows how eyebrow-raisingly similar they actually are, in a similar manner presented in the table of Chapter 8. Having reviewed the disputes currently ripping society into shreds, we need to keep in mind that they'll quickly be replaced by some new dispute. But, and this is a huge but, we'll still be stuck with each other. Investing all our personal and social energy in marking the other as evil and dangerous is a guaranteed recipe for social devastation. By reading this book, we have already taken the first step towards being agents of good in the social context. We've learned how to recognize the possible outcomes of manipulation and hate messaging in the digital era, and we've witnessed the outcomes of social polarization. Taking responsibility is in your hands. It's up to us, all of us, because as poet, singer, songwriter Paul Simon writes, "And in the naked light, I saw 10,000 people, maybe more, people talking without speaking, people hearing without listening, people writing songs that voices never shared, and no one dared disturb the sound of silence. Fools, said I, you do not know. Silence, like a cancer, grows.